you're listening to Bold, Brown and British, a weekly podcast where we discuss what it means to be a brown person in a Western world. We've spoken about colorism, third culture identity and dating amongst many others on this podcast. So if this sounds like the type of content that you want to hear, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcast, iTunes, Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also message us on Instagram. The handle is @BoldBrownAndBritish, or drop us an email via our website at www.boldbrownbritish.com. So without further ado, let's get on with this week's episode. Hello and welcome back to Bold Brown British, the podcast where we dive deep into the experiences of being a brown individual navigating the intricate tapestry of modern British society. I'm your host, Karina, and today we have the incredible treat for all of you. Joining us in the virtual studio is the incredible band members of Khiyo, whose music transcends boundaries, blending diverse influences to create a sound that is uniquely their own. Their music not only entertains, but also serves as a powerful representation of cultural amalgamation and identity. So today we have the privilege of delving into their minds and hearts of Sohini and Ollie, the talented individuals behind this remarkable band. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Karina.
Thank you.
How are you both?
Good. We have been working hard. Having a day.
So, busy, but good busy.
Good. So before we get started, can you share the kind of story behind the name, the band name itself, and how it reflects your ethos and identity?
Well, I don't. I mean, I kind of. It was sort of my idea, the Khiyo, to call it Khiyo, but I wanted something that was a bit that was fairly abstract, actually, because Sohini was coming up with lots of names in Bangla, and coming up with a band name is one of the most deadly things you can ever do, because then you're stuck with the name, and it might be. I mean, for example, the Beatles is a terrible band name, and they only came up with that because they were so rubbish when they started that they had to keep changing their band name, otherwise they wouldn't get asked back. So I mean, so we kept coming up with these names that kind of meant stuff, and then I was like, oh, that sounds a bit corny, and then I started sort of thinking of what have he used, you know, because some of the letters in Bangla have quite colourful, quite interesting kind of names, but like, so I was like, I started going through things like Chandra Bindu, and there was like, there's a band called Chandra Bindu, obviously, you know, so eventually I was like, what about Khiyo? This is Khiyo thing, and it also looks really nice. It's got this you know, interesting squiggly thing, and it could work as a symbol in its own right. You know, you remember when Prince changed his name to like that squiggle officially? I was kind of thinking that we could do our band name could literally be the squiggle of Khiyo kind of thing. So, and then that sort of went over and thought about that, and then eventually, yeah, it was good. And you know, and of course the fact that it has this kind of, it's an amalgamation of two different letters that creates its own kind of sound. That the sort of symbolism of that is quite nice, but also it was a visual thing. I really like the look of the Khiyo, and obviously we are still riding on that to an extent, using that in our artwork. You know, it's a very distinctive letter. You know.
Yeah, he had this huge Bangla dictionary, and he was just pouring through it, trying to find appropriate band names. Well, it was more a case also of trying to find something that was easily recognizable and not terribly difficult to say, which is another reason why, besides, you know, the fact that it already existed, Chandra Bindu was out. But then, when we got to Khiyo, we both were like, yeah, that's it. So when we were both able to agree, we knew, okay, we've arrived at the name.
So tell us about kind of how you guys met. What are your backgrounds, and how did the band come to life?
You know, whether it's bad or not. We met, I believe we met at a Moshimi Bomit gig, Sohini. Is that correct?
Was it that, or was it where I was singing and you and Alice told you?
Well, I think I met you before. I think I met you before all this went down. I'm sure I met you at that gig. I think you must have introduced yourself to me. I'm not totally sure it was. I'm sure.
So obviously we don't remember is the answer. But basically it was one of two things. So one, I did go to a Moshimi Bhomik gig, and Ollie was so Ollie and Moshimi have a band called Parapar, and Ben in fact as well, who's our bass player. So that's where I originally met the band According to Ollie, it might also have been because my recollection is that it was at the Brady Center where I was performing in, I can't remember what, a dramatic reading or something like that. And Ollie was performing with Motion Music there as well, actually.
Yeah.
I think. Yes.
Yeah,
So I think that was probably the same gig. We just remember it differently.
Okay. So we met, and there was so it all comes down to Motion with Monique, and I've been playing with her since about 2002, 2003. And as Ben, I brought him in because I knew him from playing in various bands and that kind of thing. So the filmmaker came over from Calcutta to do a documentary about Motion with Monique and her band that was in London, and so I got Sahini involved just to come and jam with us and be part of the film, and that's how we started working together, really.
Yes, because Motion with Monique went
quite well, you know.
Yeah, so it was more about me providing vocals for the band for the London parts of the documentary. And then after that, we just kind of kept jamming because it was just fun to do, as well as, it was just an excuse to meet up and eat lots of food. So we started jamming, and some songs just fell together so easily that we thought maybe if we just keep going, everything will fall together easily, which wasn't the case. But it was good because we started getting offers to do gigs, and then we just kind of kept going, and that's kind of how it went down, I think.
Yeah, and your music kind of encompasses, I'd say, a quite wide range of influences, with Western classical to Bengali folk. I'm curious, how do you navigate and balance the diverse elements in your composition to kind of make Bangla folk music or Bangla music sound modern but still like rooted?
I mean, it's one of those abstract things where if you start trying to specifically do it, the chances are you won't do it. You know, it's that's one of those indefinable things that can be extremely deadly. So I think all this stuff to me, all this stuff proceeds almost by feel. It's like, does this feel right? You know, so. I began to find that from the arrangement side, I was able to become more and more adventurous as we after we'd sort of defined a sort of style and certain limitations as to what we were going to do with us. I think in the early days. So
when we first started, find limitations. Then what are those? I wasn't aware that we'd found these limitations.
Oh well, it was all very acoustic, and I mean, in terms of instrumentation, it was like we weren't doing.
No, it's true.
Compared to what it is now, it was quite simple stuff, and like songs, like that might have been because we were doing simpler. Some of the rep was maybe a bit simple. Actually, it wasn't really, though, was it? Because we did that.
We did things like wasn't. So this is what happens. We start. This is pretty much exactly how it goes. Is we start thinking it's going to be really simple, and then by the end of it, there's some orchestral madness going on towards the end of the song or something. So I guess that's the thing. I was going to say exactly what Ollie did, is that you don't design that. You don't go in thinking, now I will fuse this bit and then it will come up. It's more like finding the commonalities between the different genres of music, or the way that they work together to create the right vibe. So it's not really about making modern music. For me, it is, I was born in Britain to Bangladeshi parents. So the way I experience, the way I hear this music is not going to be the same way that my parents did. And the way I'm going to express it and the people I'm going to express it with are going to be different as well. So it's more charting the journey of how this music is evolving across the globe, rather than a concerted and planned effort, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so you kind of spoke to your, I was going to say tan, but that's a Bengali word, your kind of love and your kind of attraction to Bengali music, which comes from essentially you being Bengali. But curious, I guess our listeners won't know, Ollie, what's your kind of relation with Bangla music? Why Bangla music?
My Bangla music my relationship with this goes back to about 1996 when I went on a school trip to Calcutta. So I was playing. Basically, we were going out to form an orchestra. My school wasn't a particularly good school for music at all. But we ended up doing this kind of musical exchange with the Oxford Mission in Calcutta. And there are reasons why that particular happened. I won't go into them now. So I went out. So it was a musical thing to start with, but I didn't learn anything about music when I actually went on that thing. But I felt like I think I felt when I came back, I felt like I'd kind of been defeated by the place a little bit, like, because it was seriously quite a certain amount of culture shock, obviously Calcutta in the 90s in particular. And I kind of, so I was like, I think I want to go back to see what I can make of it more than anything else, because I'm sure that, there's obviously a lot of stuff that's really interesting, but I feel like I've seen like none of it at all, frankly. I was mostly ill. And we were mostly being driven from one terrible concert to another in some minibus or whatever. So I went out again on a gap year. Then I actually made an attempt to learn Bangla, and also to seek out as much of the music as I could, and make as many musical contacts as I could. So I played in bands. I played in like rock bands locally as well. I was in a Battle of the Bands competition, formed a band. I met probably the most important thing was I met some bar musicians up in Shantiniketan, and I got to know some other people. So that was where it came from. And then really the next thing that happened was, as I was interested in the music and trying to retain my my grasp of the language, which I haven't done very well. I haven't retained that grasp of the language very well at all. But anyway, it was when somebody suggested that I worked mostly with Bomika, who was in London and was looking for somebody to work with, that kind of actually the more productive phase of my engagement with Bengali music sort of just began to take place, really. And that was around 2002, 2003. So we started sort of gigging, just me and her initially, but then I added Ben most crucially to the band, and then eventually kind of Khiyo happened, as we've just been talking about, really. So that's where it all started for me, basically.
Yeah, and both of you kind of alluded to this, but as individual with the relatively varied musical backgrounds, as well as cultural backgrounds, how do you find common ground and cohesion in your creative process?
As I said, there are two aspects. One's a kind of a positive one that Sahini's saying about finding these commonalities and that kind of thing, and you kind of just proceed by feel. The first song we did was this cover of Nishirat. So C sung it to me, and it was more like it was just the swing of it, and I was like, okay, this kind of feels like a bit of a sort of waltz or ballroom waltz, the way she was singing it. So I felt this would not be an inappropriate way of like framing the song. So some of it was like negative, though. It's also like I didn't want to produce like sort of a lot of what I feel, like a lot of Bollywood, when there's like one bit that kind of comes in totally different type of music, and there's another one, and there's another one. And I know that's part of its charm, but for me, it's always just sounded kind of weird and sort of trivial. So that kind of way of approaching music, just throwing one thing in next to each other and seeing what comes out. So we always wanted to work with something that was a bit more kind of well thought through, and that's why I said about exclude. Like we had limitations to the style. We boiled it down to only a couple of instruments. Initially, it was quite acoustic. And so I think that was how we kind of proceeded in the early days. I think now that we've established a sort of a sound, I feel that we can sort of be a bit more exploratory, hence with some of the stuff we've done more recently for film and that kind of thing.
And in terms of our influences, actually, granted, obviously, I had been much more deeply immersed into Bangla music all my life, but that's the whole point, is when you're British as well, that I also grew up around the same time as Ollie, listening to the same kind of rock music or classical music. So actually, it's not like our musical tastes are incredibly different, to be honest. They're not. So there's a lot of commonality there anyway. So in terms of when I'm, hearing something in my head, for me to try and get Ollie to understand it, it's not as difficult. Because we do have that in common anyway.
Yeah, that helps a lot, actually. Yeah, it's a certain shared, almost aesthetic. Like a musical language. Aesthetic.
Yeah.
I didn't want to single out Bollywood particularly there for the Masala thing, because I also felt that like a lot of like 90s world music was kind of like that as well. Like you'd get a bit of didgeridoo and then some tabla, and then some Bulgarian chant would come in, and to me that means nothing. It means you possess a sampler, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's so like to me that's not kind of well thought through musical to be philosophy or way of thinking. Anyway, so that yeah.
I think it was more about actually delving deep into each of these genres and looking for real connections there.
And when you kind of first started, before you kind of found your style, found your sound at that very early stages, were there any particular artists or bands or music that you were kind of taking inspiration from most of the time?
Not for me, not directly. I mean, obviously anyone would be influenced by everything they've heard throughout their lives. Of course,
yeah.
So in that sense, yes, if I grew up listening to Led Zeppelin, I'm going to be a rock chick at heart, kind of a thing, right? So, but in terms of actively thinking of any other influences while we were doing our own work, no, because the whole point of this is that we're trying to find our own sound and our own voice.
Yeah.
So in that sense, for me at least, no.
I think it's really about, it was generally drawing on this total sum of your musical experience and your listening and education, more than specifically saying, sometimes like something will come in, like that'll be, that sounds a bit like that, and then what do you do with that? Do you like actually try and avoid it, or do you sort of like try and channel your inner? I mean, I've been doing, there was some of the stuff the last album, there's some Burt Bacharach type stuff. I was like, this could be we can do some sort of classy 60s like lounge kind of stuff, but I mean, so sometimes I had that sound for certain things, but it might be just a bit of the song. Like I wanted a specific string sound from a particular Diane Warwick Bacharach recording or something like that would come in, just wanted that sound, and it would in a sense for to sort of frame something that was happening in the song. So it's hard to say. It's, as I say, I think more the sum total of what we've done over the years, basically, than any particular influences.
Yeah, and does any of your kind of non-cover songs, so your original songs, do they serve as a platform, or do you actively use them as a platform for addressing social political issues, both within the South Asian but also beyond, or are they more kind of experiences that you just want to bring forward?
Both. I mean, there are different kinds of songs. So there are songs that will address serious issues, and then there's also just songs of expression. So, but that's also the case for the heritage songs that we covered. They are specifically chosen, they're not just random songs that I knew. Because I mean, I've spent my whole life learning because of my family background, but because I was born into a family of musicians. So even the choice of songs in terms of the ones that existed before, a lot of it was, do we have a take on this that does not currently exist, that is uniquely ours? That was one factor, maybe. Or is this something that we just generally vibe with very, very quickly? Is this a message we want to impart? So with, for example, Amar Sonar Bangla, we didn't pick it because it was the national anthem of Bangladesh. It just happened to be a song that musically worked for us, and we had a take on it, and then it just happened to also be the anthem. So even with our original music, our lyricist Lisa Ghazi, she has lyrics that she writes, but then again, because I'm working with friends, we have a lot of the same sensibilities, a lot of the same influences, a lot of the same thoughts about the world and our place in it. So even her lyrics, it's easy for me to sit with those and be able to imagine what they sound like musically, because we have that connection. So Lisa will send us lyrics, and then Ollie and I will sit in the garden and then just bash out some tunes or see what happens, or revisit old melodies. So there's no one way that we make music.
Because I guess that's what it comes down to when your sound is almost kind of singularly identifiable, when it's got that quality, which I do think that you guys have. I found, I mean, I came across you on kind of YouTube with the kind of Amar Sonar Bangla, and then we met at very briefly, albeit, at the South Bank South Asian Festival. And it was, I think at both instances, it was just so clear of not just the passion, but the kind of soulfulness. I think what you guys do really well is kind of bring out the soul of the music and translate it, not just through lyrics, but through the music itself. And I've really been kind of amazed and awed by that. And I think that culture and tradition and kind of representation comes through really easily through the instruments, particularly, not just the lyrics.
Thank you. That is one thing we do actively strive for, I think.
Yeah, like a lot of thought goes into it, obviously, and there are, we can go through many different versions of an arrangement of a song until it sort of begins to seem right. I mean, I also
I feel it captures the essence.
Yeah, I'll write scores for these. Once the song is essentially written, I'll kind of really work the scores in great detail, and then we'll obviously record them, we'll play them, and then.
Or I'll veto a string part, and then we'll rework it all over again if it just doesn't feel right, even if it's musically sound. So the feel is something we take seriously, also because this is something that I believe in personally very much, because I remember once upon a time, a long time ago, I sang something, and then there was applause, and then someone was like, it was technically so good, and I thought, what kind of praise is that? I mean, technically so good. I realized that it was a compliment. It was meant to be a compliment, but that didn't really work for me. I wanted it, I wanted that person to feel something other than be impressed with what I can technically do. And so it reminded me of one of my aunts. So I was taught by my mother, and then Hiron Alam, and then both my aunts, Jannatar and Firdosar. And when I was very young, when I was a child, Jannatar had said to me that everybody has, when they sing, one thing that is theirs. And she said to me that you can sing feelings and do not take that lightly. Now, as a child, I did not understand what that really meant, so I did take it lightly. But the older I got, the more it made sense. So even when we think about what lines the instruments are going to play, Ollie and I will go through every single one of those lines, just the same way we go through every single one of the lyrical lines, so that everybody in the band understands what they're playing. So they know they're playing a feeling.
Yeah. And you guys kind of, when you first started, you had a vision for, this is how we think this song is going to sound. And through that process, you've kind of ended up with something, a completely different feeling and a different vibe, just because you're like, actually, this just feels better and this just transcends more? Or do you guys often kind of stick to that original?
I think it has happened that there's been times when for whatever reason, it happens quite a lot when we do anything for film, in fact, because that's just pure chaos from beginning to end. If I go away, everything has to be done by yesterday. If I go away and work out something, or because sometimes some of our sessions will be almost like just singing me a vocal line, a song, and me like not kind of knowing what to do with it, and then I go away and work on it. And there's times where I've come back and kind of presented something to her, and she's been. Wasn't quite what I was expecting, but it sort of works. Let's try working with that. So, I think that does sometimes happen, doesn't it, Zini?
Yeah, of course. It happens in film, but it also actually happens in our own albums as well, because I kind of want that in the sense that I already know how something sounds in Bangla in my head. So we don't go over previous versions of the songs initially, because I want the band members and I want Ollie to give me what they've got and then see what works. Now, sometimes we rework parts that he might have come up with, and they actually sound great and they work. And sometimes we discard them entirely because it just isn't working. Yeah. But certainly there have been several times where I've had something in my head, and by the time we've all worked on it, it's different. But it's not necessarily a case of, because it's better. It's more a case of, because this is what we've naturally come up with and it works. So if that's what naturally works, I try not to force things into a shape I had in my head previously, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And just to kind of wrap up, what message or feeling do you hope your listeners, for lack of a better word, take away from your music, particularly those who might not be familiar with the Bengali or South Asian music as a whole?
Okay, so for me, I just want them to take away the feeling of it, as in the language matters because it's Bangla, and for Bengalis, of course, our language matters, but it also doesn't, because it's part of the language of music when it's in that form. So we, whether you understand the words or not, feelings of, say, homesickness, nostalgia, loss, happiness, all of it, those are all very universal. And a lot of our audience is not Bengali, and I appreciate that they have been open enough to take in this music and accept it, because in the genre of world music as we know it out there, so many countries have representation, and the representation for Bangla music is relatively speaking, especially considering how obsessed we are with music, it's low. And so I think it's important for more and more people to tell their journeys artistically, if they're artists, and in whatever way they can. So for me, it's a case of, this is the journey that I'm going through as a third culture individual, and I'm doing it with other people where we're all integrating and we're finding a new way and a new cultural identity as well. So this is where we are now, and it's like charting a journey. And so if for me, anyone who's going along for that journey, feel to enjoy the journey, I guess, is what I would like them to take away.
I'm probably going back to what you said about how, for me, it's saying how the instrumental, what the instruments do is communicating the essence of it. So for somebody who doesn't have any background in Bangla at all, well, somebody who doesn't understand the lyrics, of course, and somebody who may not have any background in that kind of music at all, it's for it to be able to express what might be going on in the lyrics, and for them to sort of be able to take that on board, I think is what I'm kind of aiming for. I mean, for example, I grew up listening to lots and lots of amongst like obviously the sort of thing people were listening to, and a kid my age would have been listening to in the 90s. I grew up listening to lots of classical music, right? So a lot of it was in German or French or sometimes Italian or Russian. And pieces of music, entire operas that I know the music really well. When I actually, when I actually find out what's in them, I'm like, oh, is that what's going on there? So I didn't really know what was actually people were actually singing about, but the actual what the orchestra was doing was communicating it in a very inspiring way to me. And I kind of I'm trying to bring back, obviously I studied composition at university, classical composition. So I'm trying to sort of do, what Mahler, Strauss, or any of those guys would have done with their scores, to be able to communicate that stuff through the instrumentation. And one thing I think that people often that does come through is that I feel like not a lot of care is taken with this kind of music. Mm-hmm. Like people just, like I've played in a few kind of ad hoc bands that have been put together for functions for Bangla stuff, and it's usually like a wall of sound on stage. You can't hear what's going on. There's no rehearsal. And some of these songs are quite complex philosophically or in a literary sense, and I feel like we're just we're giving it the level of attention you'd give to a drunken wedding band playing Sweet Home Alabama, pretty much, which I feel is a bit of a shame, really, to put it that way. So this is one of the reasons why we apply this level of meticulousness to everything we do.
Yeah, and I think that depth really comes through, that kind of the layers of musicality, the kind of composition. I think it really does come through, and as I said, it becomes, in the best way possible, not about the lyrics, at least for when I've listened to it, having even understood Bengali, I'm like, actually, I love that this could be translated into Klingon and it would still have the same effect.
That's an album idea, yeah.
Yeah. Your next song,
it's there the one I thought of.
Yeah, Klingon album.
Well, thank you both so much for kind of joining us, and for our listeners, be sure to check out their latest releases. I'll leave all their social media down in the description. And until next
time. We're not the most meticulous with social media. That's what happens when you're busy being meticulous with the music. So apologies in advance for that.
Where do people find your music? Tell us.
So we are on Insta and Facebook and X and YouTube. We're just not very regular on that. We're on all the musical platforms as well, Spotify, iTunes, etc., etc. So you can find us. So it's Khiyo, and the new album is called Bondona.
Oh, Mikey, you made it till the end. I'm so happy. Well, listen, if you enjoyed what you heard and you want to hear more, subscribe to the podcast on, well, wherever you're listening to this. We are on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Deezer, TuneIn, Alexa, you name it, we're there. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on an episode. We also are on Instagram, which houses loads of behind-the-scenes audio snippets, polls, memes, and ways for you to get involved. So go follow us on Bold, Brown and British. That's the handle. And until next time, keep safe, my wonderful samosas.